I think in the environment that we live in, actually there's a more fundamental unit, which is trust. How do you build trust inside teams and inside organizations, and build trust in all kinds of different ways, right? One is, how do you trust the data that you're using itself? How do you trust the people who are using the data? Which basically is things like who has access to what, who gets to see what. And all of those are elements that we're actually trying to build into every step of the way.
Welcome to Coffee with Mr. IoT, a weekly chat with Robert Schmidt, Deloitte's chief futurist, and the builders, dreamers, founders, and wild children of the IoT universe. This podcast can also be viewed on the Coffee with Mr. IoT YouTube channel.
Today, my guest is, I'm going to say this wrong, Prukalpa Sankar. Did I get that right?
Almost.
Okay, what would have been right?
Prukalpa Sankar.
Prukalpa Sankar.
Yeah.
See, I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting me. I
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Don't worry about it.
You're the co-founder of Atlan.
Yes.
What's Atlan? Tell us about it.
Sure. So at Atlan, we're building a home for data teams, sort of like what GitHub built for engineering teams or Salesforce built for sales teams. We're building that home for data teams. So think of us as a collaboration layer, a glue almost of the different people who work inside data teams. Data teams are incredibly diverse, so engineer, scientist, analyst, business user, all kinds of different people, the tools they use and the data that they work with. So yeah, that's what we do.
So how's this different from GitHub? I mean, you use GitHub as an example. What's a data team? What's special about a data team? What do they need? What do they find when they come to Atlan?
Sure. So to begin with, maybe let me go into talking a lot more about the problem, and then I'll go from there into what we're building. So we live in an interesting world. I think every year, close to about $120 billion gets spent on data solutions around the world, but only about 27% of these data projects are actually successful.
What does successful mean, by the way?
So this is like a large survey across large corporations saying, do you believe that your data initiatives are actually successful? And mostly people say that they're not. What this has led to is, though, on one side, there's a lot of technology and tools and things like that getting created. But on the other side, if you still go back to a business user inside an enterprise and say, are you happy with the way data is used in your organization? I have literally never heard the answer yes. And we believe that the answer there really lies in what we call a human problem. Data teams are probably one of the most diverse teams that have ever been created inside an enterprise. If you want to win with data, you need an engineer to be who can deal with the scale of the data, to be able to collaborate with a scientist who builds the model, to collaborate with an economist and a researcher who says, what should your model actually talk about the theory of it, an analyst who understands the variable name, a business user who's the only person who has context, and close to about 20 of these personas in different ways and forms. All of these people have different capabilities, different ways of working, different DNA almost. They have different tools that they work with. But they all need to come together to actually be able to solve a problem. Very, very different from most other teams that have been created, like marketing teams typically created with a marketing persona. They know what the other person is doing in a lot of ways. And that's what leads to what we call collaboration overhead inside organizations. So things as simple as, when you go inside an organization, you think about, do you have access to the data that you need? Right? And today we're dealing with such large scales of data that if a business user even wants to get access to data, they need to go to IT for security. There's only an engineer who can deal with that kind of scale of data. So you have three people in that value chain just dealing with that one problem of giving access. You're talking about other challenges like when you push to production, typically something goes wrong. It's just like Murphy's Law, right? Something will go wrong. But the only person who can troubleshoot that is an engineer. The only person who can figure out if it went wrong is a business user, because they're the one who actually knows. They'll be like, oh, that data looks wrong on this dashboard. The person who's sitting in that meeting is mostly an analyst who actually has no visibility into what went wrong in production. And so obviously at that moment, that team lost agility because the business user is going to talk to the analyst is going to go talk to the engineer, blah, blah, blah. But something more fundamental happened. Trust just broke in that team. The business user is not going to trust the analyst the same way again. The analyst is not going to trust the engineer the same way again. And those are the kinds of challenges that we believe exist inside these teams. I learned this actually the hard way. I spent half a decade building up data teams, running large-scale projects, including building things like the National Data Platform for the Government of India, which the Prime Minister himself uses. And doing a bunch of that, I learned how hard it was to scale these projects.
Which role did you play on this?
I was, I guess, the data consultant or the project manager kind of person. Which is, by the way, the hardest role to hire for, because
you had to work with all three?
Yeah, pretty much. I think as we were building that up is really what led to Atlan a couple of years later, when my co-founder and I realized that the problems that we were facing scaling our own data team were problems that data teams around the world face. And so I think from there, obviously that's the long-winded answer to what are the problems that really exist out there. And these are just a couple of examples of the kind of collaboration overhead problems. But what that meant was as we started thinking about building Atlan, we said, okay, how can we really redefine the human experience of working with data? How do we make these people come together in a way that they just never did before? And that meant rethinking some of the very fundamentals of how data operates inside enterprises. So things like, for example, every other entity that you share inside an organization, if you're sharing a sales lead, typically you're going to share a link to Salesforce, like a lead profile on Salesforce. If you're sharing code, you'll share a link to a repo on GitHub. But if you're sharing data inside enterprises, you're mostly sharing the actual data. You'll share a AWS bucket, S3 bucket link, or you'll share a CSV file, but that's the actual data. So what does it mean to share data as a link? And that brings us to the next question. What does it mean for data to have a profile? What should the profile of data look like? Data is more than just the rows into columns view. We have what we call human tribal knowledge associated with data.
Human
tribal knowledge.
Tribal knowledge.
So if you, for example, speak to an analyst in an org, they'll mostly say things like, oh, in that particular analysis report that I run, I typically drop this column name for XYZ reason. That knowledge never really makes it back anywhere. One of the biggest concerns that some of the teams we work with have is what that means is onboarding, offboarding is huge challenges. Mostly people don't want to actually rerun a data project that someone else worked on. You literally want to start from scratch. What should that ideal versioning experience and support desk experience look like for data teams? These are things that have been solved in other worlds like customer support or engineering. But what does it really mean like when you sort of look at it from a data lens? Those are the kinds of problems that we're solving with Atlan today.
So is it almost like contextualizing the data, giving the data characters and a character and a description and a meaning and sort of results around this?
Yeah. So I think a core unit of the product is really what does it mean for data to have a profile, and how do you make data a first-class citizen almost inside the organization? And then around that, building a whole bunch of collaboration aspects, right? So at every step of the way, right from the first time you get access to data, if you speak to a data team, there's this question, and you might see this actually in the consulting world, where you're probably waiting for data from clients, and until you actually see the data, you can basically say nothing about the project, right? Like timeline, scope, what's it actually going to look like? The devil is in the detail. So there's this question that we often see in data teams, which is, how is the data? How is the data is basically like code speak for, what's the quality of the data like, how complete is the data, things like that. So how do you bring in those elements, again, with as much automation as possible into these teams? How do you bring in human tribal knowledge, context, and really create that confluence of basically what you can do with automation and what you need human context to bring together. And we integrate that at every step of the workflow. So right from data discovery to data exploration, data ingestion, to your data pipeline, to then pushing this into your downstream applications. So things like BI applications like Tableau or Power BI, or some contextual apps that you're using inside the organization. We sort of basically look at that entire full cycle. We integrate into the right tools at the right places, so it's not like we're rebuilding stuff, right? Like a lot of the technology for this already exists in the open source world or is built by the giants, so we sort of integrate there and build that collaboration, almost the glue for these teams to come together.
Very interesting, very interesting. So when you work with these teams today, do you have a particular example of someone who used Atlan, and what was the example and how did that help?
Sure. Sure. So I'll give you an example of a fairly large Fortune 500 company that works with us, and I'll start with some sort of core problems that they start with. So they recently made an investment in a data lake on one of the large cloud platforms, and you're talking about it. Different teams involved here. So there's a chief data officer kind of organization, which has basically made the investment into this, and an IT organization, and they've done a lot of hard work building this lake.
So they pull data from all kinds of different places and they put it in the lake
exactly.
on a regular basis. They update it so the data exists there.
Exactly. So they've tried to make that single source of all the data inside the enterprise. And then on the other hand, but the business basically keeps saying, oh, but if I still need access to data, I need to go to IT and I need to ask for access, and it takes me 14 days to get access to data. And then the data team is like, oh, but we're doing all this hard work, and business keeps telling us that they're not happy. And a lot of this is just because it's a black box, right? For business, obviously, it's a black box. For the data team, they don't know how to explain stuff to the business team. So the first step that they used us for is really to democratize access to the data in the lake, give data a profile, make it possible for business to actually get a sense of what this data really is like, how they should use this data, and for example, you can use our product to run petabytes of queries on a browser. Bring your data into environments like Excel plugins, through Excel directly, things like that. Are
you a new reporting engine therefore? I mean, are you like reports or not?
So if you think about the lifecycle, there's the data lake, and then there are downstream applications which are reports and BI tools. We sit in the middle layer.
Okay.
So what we do is we create, in cases where, for example, a business user would go to an analyst and say, create a report for XYZ reason, we actually make it possible for the business user to pull out some of those insights themselves directly on the data. But then that doesn't replace the need for reports, right? The need for reports continue to exist. And there we basically help build a pipe, which means that think of, I guess, what Zapier did for marketing, like making it really easy for any of us to set up marketing automation, and sort of tie that with the power of ETL, and hardcore, like powerful ETL. So that's where, for example, they'll start by democratizing access, and then they'll start building, for example, pipelines inside the organization to say basically something as simple as bring data from these two files, run these merge operations, push it to Tableau, right? Things like that. And the third element is starting to being able to access data from external data sources. So we bring together data from a significant number of external data providers and data sources around the world, which means that inside an organization, when a data scientist is saying, if I had access to this data, I could improve my model by 10%. They go from taking 9 months to get access to that data to actually getting that access in a couple of seconds. So that's broadly how we impact organizations. The impact that we have is in a couple of ways. We make these teams significantly more agile. We have customers telling us things like, your product saves us 2 hours a day. Now with all the extra time, I'm learning Python and I'm learning new skills. So one is just time and cost saving. The second is improved agility and time to insight. which is more than just the time saving, but how quickly can you move. And the third is actually an improved revenue impact, because they have access to data that you just didn't have access to before. And so we're seeing with, in fact, some leading companies, incredibly impactful numbers in terms of how much additional revenue they're able to drive by building models that they just couldn't before because they didn't have access to some of this data.
One of the things that I'm interested, so when you talk about profile, when you talk about access to data, I always also think about security.
Yeah.
You know, there's a big part about who gets to see what data.
Yeah.
How, is that part of the profile? How does that work?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. And I think actually I'll go one step below security, right? And I think in the environment that we live in, actually there's a more fundamental unit, which is trust. How do you build trust inside teams and inside organizations, and build trust in all kinds of different ways, right? One is, how do you trust the data that you're using itself? How do you trust the people who are using the data? Which basically is things like who has access to what, who gets to see what. And all of those are elements that we're actually trying to build into every step of the way. So what would it mean for example, so today actually people think about security and privacy often as the last step and not the first step. You sort of have a gatekeeper approach to it, which is that I'm just going to hold everything and hoard it, and I'm not going to democratize it or give access to it. And both of those approaches are not great. And so what is that balance that you build inside the organization? So our approach into this is actually to do it very behind the scenes. So we have the best of security and access control and governance baked into the product, but baked into a way that actually makes it easier for people to get access when they need it. So for example, one of the benefits of our product is that because you can run petabytes of queries on the browser, what it also means is that no one's downloading the data because you've made it easier for them not to download the data. And that's really how we think this needs to evolve. Like, it can't be a top-down enforced ABC approach, because that at some point is going to get broken for some reason. So how do you make it really easy for the people who need access to data to use the data in a way that upholds the best of security standards? And that's something that we're evolving continuously in the product.
Interesting. I read your LinkedIn profile and your Twitter, and you wrote about, so you did a variety of different things before that. What's Social Cops?
Yeah, sure. So the first company that I founded with my co-founder Varun was called Social Cops, and we basically were a data for good company. A data for good company.
Data for good, okay.
So our intent was to basically solve large-scale problems out there, things like national-level healthcare budgets and people living below the poverty line. These are problems that could use data and didn't seem like they were using data. And we thought, hey, we should do something about this. And so we spent close to half a decade building out Social Cops to scale. We possibly became one of the world's leading data for good companies. We partnered with the UN as a global partner for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, built the national data platform for the government of India, and over, I think, the course of 5 years, through our projects, possibly impacted over 1 billion lives through these data projects that we did. It was there that I think we learned a lot about what it takes to build data teams, and we realized that there was a way that instead of necessarily just us being a data team, we could actually empower teams around the world to do amazing work.
So in a way, Social Cops, the work you did to do good, taught you the problems that then led you to founding Atlan.
Yes.
Got it. Does Social Cops still exist?
Social Cops still exists. We are still a community for data for good. We still continue to do a bunch of that work as a part of Social Cops.
Interesting.
Yeah.
one of the other things I saw was you did some 30, you were chosen for some of 30 under 30 and 40 under 40. Tell us, what is that? And I know it's a very interesting community of entrepreneurs and leaders.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah.
One of your favorite experiences, maybe.
Yeah. I think we've been very lucky to have been, at a very young age, get recognition from places like, the Forbes 30 under 30, both India, Asia, Fortune 40 under 40. We made it to their cover. And a number of other sort of, I think, communities that we've had a chance to be a part of. And I think it's just something that is obviously very close to our hearts, but also I think goes back to helping our team believe that we're doing great work. I think it's more than just, very often I think the founders get a lot of credit. And I think for us it's really all of these awards are a testimony to the great work that our team and our entire team have put through for us.
I almost feel like you're giving yourself less credit now than the credit is due. What's the experience to meet with leaders like that? Give me one example where you really a big learning or something that really sort of like left a lasting impression on you.
That's a good question. One example is going to be hard. I actually can't think of it.
Give me two.
So I think one of the things that we've learned a lot, and we actually try and implement this also with the team, we actually constantly host what we call AMAs inside the company, and we call in like leaders, startup founders to actually come talk to the team in an open conversation. And I think one of the things that we've learned, being a startup founder was my first job. Like the first team I ran was there. The first person I hired was like that. The first person I fired was like that, right? And I think one of the biggest learnings that I think both me and Varun have been fortunate to have is that try and learn as much as you can from the people around you. That could mean like different skills, like different people have different strengths, obviously, right? And you have to figure out how to ask them enough questions to get that back for you. And I think what is also very surprising is that actually I've also realized that the best of people are also the most humble. They're also actually very willing to give you time. They're also very, like, if they actually see you're earnest about this, obviously, like, you're not wasting their time, but if you're actually honest about it, we've seen people taking out time to actually give back. We've had people who in some ways would be termed as competitors talk to us and say, these are all the mistakes we made. And I think the entire community, I think really at the end of it, people want to help. And if you believe that, and if you have the courage to ask, then you get back. So I don't think I have one experience, I just have so many where, people have really helped, and that's really how you move forward. But then you also remember that also puts a responsibility on you to give back
too.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Thanks for listening to Coffee with Mr. IoT. To subscribe or to listen to more episodes, search for Coffee with Mr. IoT in your favorite podcatcher, or find us online at deloitte.com/US/Coffee with Mr. IoT. To watch the video version of our show, go to YouTube and search Coffee with Mr. IoT.